I need one answer. Evelyn, I'm at work. Do you love Rachel? The line went quiet, not silent in a dramatic way. I could hear movement behind him, a door closing, his breathing shifting as he stepped somewhere private. 5 seconds passed, then 10. If the answer had been no, he would have said it immediately. Instead, Daniel said, "It's complicated." I closed my eyes. And there it was. The answer he did not have the courage to say properly. "No," I said quietly, "it really isn't." "Evelyn, don't come home tonight." "What?" I said, "Don't come home tonight." "You can't just—" "I can and I am." His voice sharpened. "You're being dramatic." That word should have hurt. It didn't. It only confirmed what I already knew. For months, Daniel had been making choices behind my back. Now that I was making one in front of him, suddenly I was the unstable one. "I'll text you when your things are ready," I said. Then I hung up before he could turn my heartbreak into another debate. When I got home, the apartment looked exactly the same. That almost made it worse. His jacket still hung by the door. His shoes were still kicked halfway under the bench. His coffee mug sat in the sink. Our framed engagement photo still leaned on the bookshelf, both of us smiling like people who had no idea one of them was already standing with one foot outside the relationship. I looked at that photo for a long moment. Then I took it down. After that, I walked into the bedroom, opened the closet, and started packing. Packing his things should have felt dramatic. Movies make it look dramatic. People cry into cardboard boxes. They stop every few minutes to stare at old photographs. They collapse onto the floor, overwhelmed by memories. My experience was different. I felt strangely focused, like my brain had decided emotions would only slow me down. So I folded shirts, stacked jeans, wrapped his watch collection in towels so nothing would get scratched. Every item went into a box. Every box became another piece of evidence that the future I had spent years imagining no longer existed. Around midnight, I found the sweatshirt he always wore when he was sick, the faded gray one with paint stains on the sleeve. For a second, I froze. The sweatshirt itself wasn't what stopped me. What hit me was the memory of a night 2 years earlier when he had the flu and spent 3 days on the couch complaining that he was dying while I brought him soup and medicine. He had looked at me that week and said, "I'm going to marry you someday." Back then, I believed him. The memory hit harder than anything Lauren had told me, because it reminded me that the relationship hadn't always been broken. There had been good years, real years. That's what makes betrayal so complicated. If someone is awful from the beginning, leaving is easy. The hard part is leaving someone who was once exactly who you needed them to be. By 3 a.m, 6 large boxes were lined up against the living room wall. The boxes held everything he had accumulated while living with me. Clothes, shoes, books, electronics, toiletries, and all the ordinary things that suddenly felt strangely temporary. I stood there looking at them, exhausted but unable to sleep. Then I noticed something sitting on the bookshelf. Our engagement photo. I had forgotten to pack it. In the picture, Daniel was holding me from behind while we smiled at the camera. We looked ridiculously happy. The kind of couple other people point to and say, "They're definitely going to make it." I picked up the frame, studied it for a few seconds, then placed it carefully into the final box. The next morning, I called a locksmith. By lunchtime, the locks were changed. Watching the technician replace them felt surreal. Part of me kept expecting guilt to appear. It never did. What I felt instead was relief. Not because the relationship was over, because I was finally doing something instead of waiting for Daniel to decide what happened next. For weeks, I had been reacting to his choices. Now I was making my own. Around 2 o'clock that afternoon, my phone started ringing. "Daniel." I let it ring. Then ring again. Then again. Eventually, he texted, "We need to talk." A minute later, "This is insane." Then, "You're overreacting." Then, "Answer your phone." I stared at the messages. The progression was interesting. Not one apology. Not one explanation. Not one acknowledgement of what he'd done. Just frustration that I wasn't cooperating. 3 hours later, I finally replied, "Your things are packed." The response arrived almost instantly. "What does that mean?" I laughed softly. Not because it was funny, because he genuinely seemed confused. As if discovering he had feelings for another woman while planning a wedding should somehow have no consequences. It means exactly what it sounds like. My phone rang before I could set it down. This time I answered. "Evelyn, what the hell are you doing?" His voice was sharp, angry, and louder than necessary. "I packed your things. You don't get to decide we're over by yourself." That sentence told me more about Daniel than anything he'd said all week. Not because of the words, because of the assumption behind them, as if ending our engagement required his permission. "As far as I'm concerned, you decided that months ago." "What is that supposed to mean?" "You know exactly what it means." He exhaled heavily. "The way people do when they're trying to stay patient with someone they think is being unreasonable." Except this time, I was the only one in the conversation who wasn't lying. Evelyn, Rachel, and I talked. Right. We got close. Right. But you're acting like I had a full-blown affair. I leaned against the kitchen counter. The anger I expected still hadn't arrived. Mostly I felt tired. Telling another woman things you should be telling your fiancé isn't innocent. It wasn't like that. Then explain what it was like. The line went quiet. Not because there wasn't an answer, because there wasn't a good one. Finally, he said, "You don't understand." That had become his favorite phrase. Every liar eventually finds one. Something vague enough to avoid specifics. Something flexible enough to explain anything. I understand more than you think. No, you don't. Then help me. I waited. Nothing. Tell me why Rachel knew things about your life that I didn't. Silence. Tell me why you spent months talking to her. Nothing. Tell me why you lied about where you were. Still nothing. When Daniel finally spoke again, his voice sounded different. Less angry. More defensive. I didn't mean for this to happen. There it was. The closest thing to honesty I'd heard so far. Not an apology. Just an admission that events had escaped his control. The problem was that things like this don't just happen. People make them happen. One conversation. One text. One secret. One lie at a time. You had months to stop it. Evelyn, shh. You had months to tell me. I was trying to figure things out. I almost laughed. Figure things out. While planning a wedding. While tasting cake samples. While discussing seating charts. While letting me build a future he wasn't sure he wanted. The selfishness of it was breathtaking. Congratulations, I said quietly. What? You figured it out. He was silent. For the first time, I think he realized there was no fixing this. No perfect explanation. No argument. No negotiation. The version of me that always gave him another chance had finally disappeared. A few minutes later, he asked the question I think he'd been avoiding. So that's it? I looked around the apartment. At the empty spaces where his things used to be. At the boxes waiting by the wall. At the life we were supposed to build together. Yes. Another pause. Then, I never wanted to hurt you. The words landed strangely. Maybe because I actually believed him. I don't think Daniel wanted to hurt me. He simply wanted whatever made him happiest in the moment. The problem was that people like that usually leave damage behind them. Not because they're evil, because they're selfish. And selfish people often mistake desire for destiny. I know, I said. That seemed to surprise him. You do? Yes. He waited. So why are you doing this? I looked down at the engagement ring sitting on the table. The ring he'd slipped onto my finger 6 months earlier while promising forever. The ring that suddenly felt like it belonged to a completely different woman. Because wanting something doesn't excuse what you did to get it. He didn't respond. And for the first time since this started, neither did I. The call ended a few moments later. No screaming. No dramatic goodbye. Just two people reaching the end of something neither could save. Friday morning, Daniel arrived with his younger sister. I had expected him eventually. What I hadn't expected was the look on his face. He looked exhausted. Not guilty. Not heartbroken. Exhausted. Like someone who hadn't slept much since the truth came out. When the doorbell rang, I already knew who it was. I opened the door but left the security chain on. Daniel stared at me. For a second, I saw something familiar in his eyes. The man I had loved. The man I thought I was going to marry. Then it disappeared, replaced by frustration. We need to talk. No. Evelyn! No, Daniel. His sister shifted awkwardly beside him, clearly wishing she were anywhere else. I came for my things. Good. I disappeared inside and brought out the first box. Then another. Then another. The entire process took almost 20 minutes. Neither of us said much. What was left to say? Every important conversation should have happened months earlier. Finally, only one box remained. The one containing the engagement photo. I handed it to him. His eyes dropped toward the frame, visible through the cardboard opening. For the first time, he looked genuinely sad. Not defensive. Not irritated. Sad. Maybe reality was finally catching up. Maybe he was realizing that fantasy relationships look very different once they're measured against actual loss. I didn't know. And honestly, it wasn't my responsibility to know anymore. Then his gaze shifted to my left hand. The ring was gone. He noticed immediately. His expression changed. What did you do with it? I reached into my pocket, pulled it out, and held it between us. For a second, neither of us moved. The diamond caught the afternoon sunlight. 6 months earlier, it had symbolized our future. Now it felt like evidence from a closed case. Take it. Evelyn. Take it. He stared at the ring, then at me, then back at the ring. Finally, he accepted it. The moment it left my hand, something inside me loosened. A knot I'd been carrying for weeks, maybe longer. Daniel opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something. Apologize. Explain. Ask for another chance. I never found out, because before he could speak, I stepped back and closed the door. The strangest thing about ending a long relationship is that life keeps moving as if nothing important happened. The Monday after Daniel picked up his boxes, I still had to go to work. Emails still arrived. Meetings still happened. People still complained about deadlines and parking and coffee machines. Meanwhile, my wedding had evaporated. For a few days, it felt like I was living two completely different lives at the same time. On the surface, everything looked normal, but underneath it felt like my entire future had disappeared. The apartment felt different immediately. Not better. Not worse. Just different. His shoes weren't by the door anymore. His jacket wasn't hanging in the hallway. His toothbrush wasn't beside mine. The absence of those things was impossible to ignore. For the first week, I kept catching myself turning toward his side of the couch whenever something funny happened on television. Then I'd remember there was nobody there. Those moments hurt more than the arguments. Because arguments belong to the ending. Habits belong to the life you thought you were going to have. The wedding cancellation started shortly afterward. That process was almost as exhausting as the breakup itself. Every phone call required the same conversation. Yes, the wedding was canceled. No, we weren't rescheduling. No, there wasn't another date. No, I didn't want to discuss it. Some vendors were sympathetic. Others were strictly business. Either way, every canceled reservation felt like crossing another item off a future that no longer existed. The venue deposit was gone. Some catering money was non-refundable. A few other expenses disappeared with them. It wasn't enough to ruin me financially, but it was enough to sting. Still, every time I looked at the numbers, I found myself thinking the same thing. Expensive lesson. Cheap compared to divorce. The group chat remained mostly quiet for about a week. People were talking privately now. Checking on me. Checking on Daniel. Trying to understand what had happened without becoming part of it. Then Monday afternoon changed everything again. I was sitting at my desk when my phone buzzed. The notification came from the group chat, Daniel. For a second, I considered ignoring it. Then curiosity got the better of me. I opened the message. Immediately, I wished I hadn't. It was long, the kind of statement someone spends hours rewriting before finally posting. At first glance, it sounded like an apology. By the second paragraph, it became obvious that it wasn't. It was a justification. Daniel admitted that he and Rachel had developed feelings for each other. He admitted they had been talking for months. He admitted their connection had become emotionally important to him long before our relationship ended. Then he started explaining why. He wrote about feeling understood, feeling heard, feeling connected. He talked about how relationships sometimes change and how life isn't always black and white. By the time I reached the end, I was staring at my screen in disbelief. It wasn't that he had confessed. It was the way he framed it. Reading the message felt like watching someone describe a car accident while carefully avoiding mention of who grabbed the steering wheel. The responses arrived almost immediately. My sister was first. So you're admitting Evelyn was right? One of our friends followed. Wait, are you seriously blaming this on growing apart? Another friend simply wrote, Dude. Daniel tried defending himself. He said nobody intended to get hurt. He said things became complicated. He said emotions weren't crimes. The more he explained, the worse it sounded. Because every explanation raised another question. And every answer revealed another choice he could have made differently. Then Lauren entered the conversation. She hadn't said much publicly up to that point. Most of what she knew had been shared with me privately. That changed with one message. Stop rewriting what happened. The group chat went quiet for several minutes. Then Lauren continued. You spent months building an emotional relationship with another woman while planning a wedding. That's what happened. Own it. Nobody responded right away. Not even Daniel. Because there wasn't much left to argue with. The truth had finally become visible to everyone. Not just me. Not just Lauren. Everyone. The conversation fell apart after that. Some people left the chat entirely. Others stopped commenting. A few tried to remain neutral. But neutrality becomes difficult once the facts are sitting in plain view. I didn't participate. I didn't need to. The situation was speaking for itself. By the end of the day, the friend group had quietly divided. Not through some dramatic confrontation. Just through individual choices. People deciding who they wanted around them. What kind of behavior they were willing to excuse. And what they weren't. A few days later, another surprise arrived. An email. From a lawyer. At first, I thought it had to be some mistake. Then I opened it. Apparently, Daniel was requesting compensation related to wedding expenses and several financial contributions made during the relationship. I read the email twice. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was ridiculous. Months of dishonesty. Months of emotional cheating. Months of deception. And somehow the conversation had arrived at legal threats. I forwarded everything to an attorney my family had used before. He called me later that afternoon. The first thing he said was, "Please tell me this is a joke." That was reassuring. I laughed. So that's good news? It's excellent news. He spent the next 15 minutes explaining exactly why the claims had little chance of going anywhere. The letter wasn't designed to win. It was designed to pressure, to scare, to create leverage. Once I understood that, the anxiety disappeared almost immediately. Nothing came from it. No lawsuit. No court filing. Nothing. A week later, my attorney sent a formal response addressing every claim line by line. The moment Daniel realized everything was documented and supported by records, the legal threats disappeared. After that, I never heard another word about a lawsuit. Just another attempt to control a situation that was already over. Then came the twist nobody expected. About 2 weeks later, Lauren called. Her voice sounded hesitant, almost uncomfortable. "Do you want the latest update?" I wasn't sure I did, but curiosity won again. "What happened?" She hesitated, then said, "Rachel's pulling away from him." I sat upright. "What?" Apparently things aren't going well. The irony was almost painful. Daniel had spent months risking everything for that relationship. Our engagement, our home, his reputation, his friendships. And now reality had finally arrived. Lauren explained that things had been much easier when the relationship existed inside fantasy. Secret messages, private conversations, stolen emotional intimacy. Real life was different. Real life involved consequences, expectations, pressure, actual commitment. The same commitment Daniel had spent months avoiding. By the time Lauren finished explaining, I wasn't angry. I wasn't happy either. Mostly I felt detached. Daniel's decisions no longer belonged to me. Whatever happened next was his responsibility, not mine. For the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely free. A few weeks later, Daniel's mother called. I almost didn't answer. She had always been kind to me, and that made the conversation harder. Not easier. When I picked up, she sounded exhausted. "Evelyn? Hi." There was a brief pause. Then she sighed. "I owe you an apology." I closed my eyes. "You don't." "Yes, I do." Her voice cracked slightly. I wanted to believe him. I could hear the disappointment in her voice. For months she had defended him because he was her son. Now she sounded like someone finally coming to terms with the fact that the version of events she wanted to believe simply wasn't true. I understood that. Parents often do. Nobody wants to believe their child is capable of hurting someone they love. She told me she'd finally had a long conversation with Daniel. A real one. Not excuses. Not half-truths. The truth. He admitted he had been reconnecting with Rachel for months. He admitted he knew his feelings were becoming inappropriate long before the relationship ended. He admitted he kept pushing the problem forward because he didn't want to deal with the consequences. None of it surprised me. Not anymore. Still, hearing someone else say it made the situation feel final. His mother apologized again. I told her she didn't need to. Because she didn't. Daniel was responsible for Daniel. Not her. We spoke for another 15 minutes before saying goodbye. When the call ended, I felt something I hadn't felt since this whole mess started. It wasn't perfect closure, and maybe nobody ever gets that, but it was enough. For the first time in months, I felt like I could finally leave the story behind instead of carrying it everywhere with me. Life improved gradually after that. Not overnight. Not dramatically. Just steadily. Work got better. My concentration returned. I stopped checking my phone every 5 minutes. I stopped replaying conversations in my head. I stopped wondering whether I could have saved the relationship. Eventually, I received a promotion. The timing felt almost absurd. While Daniel had spent months pretending late nights were about work, I had actually been building a future. Not intentionally. Not to prove anything. Simply by continuing to show up. Continuing to move forward. A few months later, I repainted the apartment. Bought a new couch. Hosted friends again. The place slowly stopped feeling like a museum dedicated to a failed engagement. It started feeling like home. My home. Nearly a year after the breakup, a group of us were having dinner together. Lauren was there. My sister was there. Several friends from the original group chat were there too. At one point, someone told a story about a boyfriend who got caught lying about where he'd been. Without missing a beat, Lauren grinned and said, "Can somebody pick him up from work?" The entire table burst out laughing, including me, especially me, because for the first time, the memory didn't hurt. It was simply part of my story, a chapter I survived, nothing more. People still ask whether I regret sending that screenshot. The answer surprises them. I don't. Could I have handled things privately? Probably. Could I have avoided some drama? Maybe. But the screenshot didn't destroy my relationship. The relationship was already falling apart. The screenshot simply exposed what had been hidden. Daniel made his choices. I made mine. Looking back, I don't remember most of the arguments anymore. I remember sitting alone in that apartment after he left. I remember staring at the screenshot that changed everything. I remember realizing that my instincts had been right all along. Most of all, I remember feeling grateful that the truth came out before the wedding instead of after it. Losing Daniel hurt. Spending the rest of my life married to someone who was already choosing someone else would have hurt far more. Looking back, the GPS screenshot didn't ruin my future. It saved it.